friends, welcome to Wednesday. Today we're going to start the next section of Ramona and Beezus. This section is called Beezus and Her Imagination. Beezus and Ramona both looked forward to Friday afternoons after school. Beezus because she attended the art class at the recreation center in Glenwood Park. Ramona because she was allowed to go to the park with Beezus and play in the sand pile until the class was over. This Friday, while Beezus held Ramona by the hand and waited for the traffic light to change from red to green, she thought how wonderful it would be to have an imagination like Ramona's. Oh, you know Ramona. Her imagination runs away with her, Mother said, when Ramona made up a story about seeing a fire engine crash into a garbage truck. That child has an imagination a mile long, the Quimby's grown-ups friends remarked when Ramona sat in the middle of the living room floor in a plastic wading pool she had dragged out from the basement and pretended she was a boat in the middle of a lake. Did you ever see such an imagination in such a little girl? The neighbors asked one another when Ramona hopped around the yard pretending she was the Easter Bunny. It was a spring day and Ramona had got lost because she started out to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The rainbow had appeared to end in the park until she reached the park, but then it looked as if it ended behind the supermarket. When the police brought Ramona home, her father said, "Sometimes I think Ramona has too much imagination." Nobody, reflected Beezus, ever says anything about my imagination. Nobody at all. And she wished more than anything that she had an imagination. Oh, how pleased Miss Ribbons, the art teacher, would be if she had an imagination like Ramona's. Unfortunately, Beezus was not very good at painting, at least not the way Mrs. Ribbons wanted boys and girls to paint. She wanted them to use their imaginations and feel free. Beezus still squirmed with embarrassment when she thought of her first painting, a picture of a dog with a bow coming out of his mouth in a balloon. Mrs. Ribbons pointed out that only in the funny papers did dogs have bow coming out of their mouths in balloons. Bow in a balloon was not art. And when Miss Ribbons did think of one of Beezus's paintings was good enough to put on the wall, she always tacked it way down at the end, never at the center. Beezus wished she could have a painting in the center of the wall. "Hurry up, Ramona," Beezus coaxed. Then she noticed that her sister was dragging a string along behind her. "Oh, Ramona," she protested, "why did you have to bring Ralph with you?" Ralph was an imaginary green lizard Ramona liked to pretend she was leading by a string. You can see Ramona leading her imaginary pet lizard. "I love Ralph," said Ramona firmly, "and Ralph likes to go to the park." Beezus knew it was easier to pretend along with Ramona than to try and make her stop. Anyway, it was better to have her pretend to lead a lizard than to pretend to be a lizard herself. "Can't you carry him?" she suggested. "No," said Ramona, "he's slimy." When the girls came to the shopping district, Ramona had to stop at the drugstore scales and pretend to weigh herself while Beezus held Ralph's string. "I weigh 11 pounds," she announced, while Beezus smiled at Ramona's idea of her weight. "It just goes to show you how much of imagination Ramona has," she thought. At the radio and phonographer store, Ramona insisted on petting his master's voice, the black and white plaster dog, bigger than Ramona, that always sat with one ear cocked in the front door. Beezus thought admiringly about the amount of imagination it took to pretend that a scared, chipped plastic dog was real. If only she had an imagination like Ramona's, maybe Mrs. Robins would say that her paintings were free and imaginative, and she would tack them up in the middle of the wall. When they reached the park, Beezus left Ramona and Ralph at the sandpile, and feeling more and more discouraged at her own lack of imagination, hurried to the recreation center. The class had already poured paints into their muffin tins and were painting on paper thumb-tacked to drawing boards. The room hummed with activity. Mrs. Robins, wearing a gray paint-smeared smock, flew from one artist to another, praising, correcting, suggesting. Beezus waited until Mrs. Robins finished explaining to a boy that he should not outline a mouth with black paint. Her mouth wasn't outlined in black, was it? Then Beezus said, "I'm sorry I'm late, Mrs. Robins." She stared in fascination at Miss Robins' earrings. They were almost to her shoulders, and they were made of silver wire, twisted and bent into interesting shapes. Not the shape of anything in particular, just interesting shapes. "That's all right," said Mrs. Robins, her earrings swinging, smiling at Beezus. "Get your paints and paper. Today everyone is painting an imaginary animal." "An imaginary animal?" Beezus repeated blankly. How could she possibly think of an imaginary animal? As Beezus poured paints into her muffin tin and tacked a sheet of paper to her drawing board, she tried to think of an imaginary animal. But all the animals she could think of, cats, dogs, cows, horses, lions, giraffes, they were discouragingly real. Reluctantly, Beezus took the only vacant seat, which was beside a boy named Wayne, who came to class only because his mother made him. Once Beezus had hung her sweater on the back of a chair, and Wayne had printed "Post No Bills" on it in chalk. Beezus had worn it all the way home before she discovered it. Since then she did not care to sit beside Wayne. Today she noticed he had parked a grape-flavored lollipop on a paper towel beside his muffin tin of paints. "Hi, Bees," he greeted her. "No fair licking my sucker." "I don't want to lick your lollipop," answered Beezus, "and don't call me Bees." "Okay, Bees," said Wayne. At that moment the door opened and Ramona walked into the room. She was still dragging the string behind her, and she looked angry. "Why, hello," said Mrs. Robins pleasantly. "Oh, Ramona, you're supposed to be playing in the sand pile," said Beezus, going over to her. "No," said Ramona flatly. "How we threw sand on Ralph." Her dark eyes were busy taking in the paints, the brushes, the drawing boards. "I'm going to paint," she announced. "Mother said you were supposed to play in the sand pile," protested Beezus. "You're too little for this class." "You say that about everything," complained Ramona. Then she turned to Mrs. Robins. "Don't step on Ralph," she said. "Ralph is a make-believe green lizard she pretends she leads around on a string." Beezus was embarrassed to have to explain such a silly thing. Mrs. Robins laughed. "Well, here is a little girl with a lot of imagination. How would you like to paint a picture of Ralph for us, Ramona?" Beezus could not help feeling annoyed. Mrs. Robins was letting Ramona stay in the class, the one place where she was not allowed to tag along. Mrs. Robins would probably like her painting because it was so full of imagination. Ramona's pictures, in fact, were so full of imagination that it took even more imagination to tell what they were. Ramona beamed at Mrs. Robins, who found a drawing board for her and a stool, which she placed between Beezus and Wayne. She lifted Ramona onto the stool. "There, now you can share your sister's paints," she said. Ramona looked oppressed at being allowed to paint with such big boys and girls. She sat quietly on her stool, watching everything around her. "Maybe she'll behave herself after all," thought Beezus as she dipped her brush into the blue paint. "And now I don't have to sit next to Wayne." Since Beezus still had not thought of an imaginary animal, she decided to start with the sky. "Do the sky first," Beezus whispered to Ramona, who looked as if she did not know how to begin. Then Beezus faced her own work, determined to be free and imaginative. To be free on a piece of paper was not as easy as it sounded. Mrs. Robins always said to start with the big areas of a picture and paint them bravely and boldly. So Beezus spread the sky on her paper with brave, bold strokes. Back and forth across the paper she swept her brush. Brave and bold and free. That was the way to do it. The sky turned out to be too wet, so while it dried a little, Beezus looked at what the other boys and girls were doing. Celia, who sat on her left, had already filled a brave, bold background with pink, which she had sprinkled with big purple dots. Now she was painting a long gray line that wound all over her paper, in and out around the dots. "What's that supposed to be?" whispered Beezus. "Not sure yet," answered Celia. Beezus felt better because Celia was the kind of girl who usually knew exactly what she was doing, and whose pictures were often tacked in the center of the wall. The boy on the other side of Celia, who always wanted to paint airplanes, was painting what looked like a giraffe made out of pieces of machinery, and another boy was painting a thing that had two heads. Beezus looked across to Ramona and Wayne. He had not bothered with the sky at all. He had painted a hen. Beezus knew it was a hen because he had printed in big letters, "This is a real hen," with an arrow pointing to it. Wayne always tried to do just the opposite of what Mrs. Robins wanted. "Hey, quit peeking," said Wayne in a loud voice. "I'm not peeking," said Beezus, hastily trying to look as if she had been interested in Ramona's paper all along. Ramona had dipped her brush into blue paint and had painted a stripe across the top of her paper. "That's the sky," she said happily. "But that's not the way the sky is," Beezus said, trying to be helpful. She felt better because Ramona had not plunged in and painted a picture full of imagination. "Skies should come farther down the paper." "The sky is up," said Ramona firmly. Beezus decided she couldn't waste time explaining about skies, not when she hadn't thought of an imaginary animal. Maybe she could take a real animal and sort of change it around. "Let's see," she thought. "I could take a horse and put feathers on it." No, all those feathers would be too hard to paint. Wings, that was it. A horse with wings was an imaginary animal. A real imaginary animal, because Mother had once read a story aloud about a Pegasus, a winged horse, out of a library book. In the story, Pegasus had been white, which was a real horse color. Beezus decided to be extra imaginative. She would make her horse green, a green horse against a blue sky. Mrs. Robins ought to like that. Beezus did not think blue and green looked very pretty together, but Mrs. Robins often liked colors that Beezus thought did not really go together. Beezus dipped her brush into the green paint and outlined a wing against the sky. Next she outlined the body of a horse and a long tail that hung down. It was a magnificent horse. At least Beezus hoped it would look magnificent when she finished it. Anyway, it was big because Mrs. Robins likes her artist to cover the whole paper. Quickly and neatly Beezus filled in the outline of the horse, because Mrs. Robins, who was looking at Celia's picture, would look at hers next. Somehow, the horse was not exactly what Beezus had had in her mind's eye, but even so, compared to what Cecilia was painting, a green horse with wings was a very good imaginary animal. And except for a couple soggy places in the sky, her work was much neater than Celia's. Beezus waited for Mrs. Robins to point this out. Instead, Miss Robins said, "Celia, your picture is a work to be proud of. It's a difficult thing to be as free as this." Then Mrs. Robins moved to Beezus, her long earrings swinging forward as she leaned over the drawing board. Beezus waited anxiously. Maybe her picture wasn't good at all. If Mrs. Robins liked a gray line winding around a lot of purple dots, maybe she wouldn't like a flying horse. Maybe she liked things with no special shape, like those earrings. "You have a good sky, even if it is a little wet," said Mrs. Robins. Beezus was disappointed. Anybody could have a good sky. Mrs. Robins continued to study picture. "Try to think how a horse would look if it were really flying." Beezus tried to think. "What about the tail?" asked Miss Robins. "Wouldn't the tail fly out instead of hanging down? Especially if the wind blew real hard," said Wayne. "Can you make the horse look rounder?" said Miss Robins. Think of how a horse looks with the sun shining on it. Part of him would be in the shadows." "Not that horse," said Wayne. "She just copied it off a Mobilgas billboard. She only made it green instead of red." "I did not," said Beezus indignantly. Then she stared at her painting again. Now that Wayne pointed out, she could see that her horse looked like on the gas billboard at the service station where her father bought gasoline. He was a flat cardboard horse, not a magnificent horse at all. Her horse wasn't even as good as the horse on the billboard, because instead of a flying tail, he had a tail that hung down like a mop. "All right, Wayne," said Miss Robins. "I'm sure Beezus did not mean to copy anything from a billboard." "No, I didn't," said Beezus mournfully. "I was only trying to change a real animal around to make it imaginary, but I just don't have an imagination, that's all." "Why, Beezus, of course you have an imagination." Mrs. Robins sounded shocked at the idea of anyone not having an imagination. Let's see what happens with Beezus's imagination tomorrow.